everybody, and welcome to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host, Megan Lewis, and today I am joined by the wonderful Luiza, who is a PhD student at the University of Chicago. Luiza was one of our HAP scholars for this summer, so she has come back to tell us how everything went. Luiza, welcome back. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
Could you, for everyone who missed your first interview, give us a bit of background on who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah, so I'm currently a third-year PhD student at the University of Chicago. I got my undergraduate degree at Brown in Egyptology and archaeology, and I'm Brazilian, so I don't remember how much I told you about this, so if I become obnoxiously repetitive, please tell me. But when I went to the US to do my undergrad, I didn't think Egyptology was a viable path for me because it's not really a field that's supported here, so it had never really been something that seemed possible. But then I took this amazing class my freshman fall, actually, and it just became super clear to me that I really wanted to do this and that I really loved it. So here I am now, 7 years later. That's kind of insane. Yeah, but my main interest in Egyptology and Egyptian archaeology is kingship, which is what I'm hoping to continue studying for my dissertation. And I look at it in different ways. So in terms of monumentality, for example, or art, literature, just different ways in which the institution of kingship was legitimized and expressed in ancient Egypt.
Thank you very much. What were you planning on doing over the summer? And did you manage to do any of it, given that we've all been quarantined during a pandemic?
Good question. So originally, actually, I applied for this grant to work in Petra in a project. I worked there in the field. Obviously, that didn't happen. So then I switched to just trying to get in to start my dissertation research because as a third year, I'm not actually actively writing my dissertation yet. It's more in the process of thinking through the topic and stuff like that. But then I got stuck in Brazil without libraries, which makes it really hard to actually, pull things off the shelf and start thinking about things. So I did work on it, but much less than I would have liked to. The most substantial thing I did with regards to that was to lead a reading group with SASA, Save Ancient Studies in America. I think I'm very bad with acronyms. Yes, that sounds correct.
Yep, nope, that's right.
Yeah, so I led a reading group on, it was called Pharaoh Triumphant, and it was really looking at royal texts that are usually seen as propagandistic to try and tease out what we can learn about Egyptian kingship from, this is not the correct term for it, but the reality of Egyptian kingship, I suppose. So how did it actually affect regular people? If it did, what was the extent of that influence? And it was great because SASA, if any of you listening don't know about SASA, you should look it up. And we have these different reading groups that kind of gather a bunch of people with different backgrounds into the same room, in this case, a Zoom room, unfortunately. But then we just get the opportunity to talk about these texts together. And mine was particularly fruitful because I had people from political science, for example, and that's literature that I'm not very familiar with. So I got to talk more about ideology in terms of not just how we frame it in Egyptology. And they recommended a lot of literature that I'll be looking at while trying to actually draft this proposal.
That sounds really useful, actually, because one of the things that I feel like we're encouraged to do is interdisciplinary research, but then a lot of the time actually working out where you should go to find resources in a subject area that's completely different to your own can be very, very difficult.
Yeah, no, it was great. And I don't remember the titles right now, of course, because that's what happens when you're interviewing for things. But I have a list of, I think, at least 5 books that I was told would be a very good starting point on that front. And of course, I plan to do comparative research in other ancient fields as well. But this just seems like a good way to maybe get at the material from a very different perspective that isn't really used in Egyptology. So yeah, it was really great.
And I ask this knowing that you haven't done your dissertation research yet, so all answers are very preliminary, and no one here is going to hold you to anything, I promise. But what are your thoughts and impressions on the differences between how kingship is maybe portrayed in the texts and possibly how it would have played out on the ground?
Yeah, that's exactly what I want to try and figure out. And the issue with this topic is that it's really hard to tell how possible it is to answer that question. I don't think it's one that we'll ever get a full answer to, but I think it's possible to tease out maybe more than we already have on that. I do think the texts are extremely propagandistic. I'm trying to think of the Battle of Kadesh, for example, Ramses II. And I don't know if you saw this, but there was a meme going around with the American elections.
I did see that.
Yeah, it was good. It was good. But Ramses says that he won this fight by a landslide, essentially. And when we look at the Hittite sources, we learn that that really wasn't what happened at all. And I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that's just, I think, a very clear example of how misleading these texts can be. Obviously, the point of the texts was to elevate kingship and to showcase its legitimacy. So they are true in that sense, but it does. I think there's a lot more to be done to try and disentangle that. I don't really have the way to do it yet.
I suspect the answer to this question is no, but do we have any evidence kind of from a non-royal perspective about the kings, or is everything very much filtered through that official lens?
It's mostly, yeah, filtered through either the royal texts themselves or elite texts, and that's a separate issue because obviously the elites really depended on the king. We have these periods when that's a little less clear, the intermediate periods we call them, where the institution of kingship itself was less strong and centralized. But for when Egyptian kingship really was as strong as we usually think of it, the elites were very much tied to the king. And so you're kind of preaching to the choir in that sense. The texts are talking to an audience, the literate audience that would actually get to look at the text and the art that showcases the king in that way already believed in it, I think, or at least for them, it made sense.
They had a vested interest in upholding it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's mostly what we have, which is really the issue. We do have private texts. For example, the traditional offering formula, which is found in most funerary monuments in Egypt, whether they be high elite or lower class. And I looked at this summer, actually, and I'm trying to see if that's a way to, maybe a small way into this. But the offering formula starts with an offering which the king gives. And it's really found on monuments that are not extremely high elite. So it seems like, I mean, whether they were aware of it or not, that they relied on the king as well. Regular people relied on the king to have a successful afterlife. But again, there's a question of whether this is just codified religion that's kind of filtered down without much thought to it, or if it was an active, like, I know that the king is going to give me this offering that I need to survive. And that's, again, just an example, but most of what we have is kind of filtered through that very ambiguous lens. So yeah, it's really hard to get at it.
It's very difficult to kind of unpack and work out how to get at that difference in like relationship or like lived reality, I suppose.
Right.
That's tricky.
Yeah, it's a question that has been asked in terms of Egyptian religion, and I think that's a very parallel question in many ways, like how much was the official religion present in private contexts, and how much of private religion can we see? And that has been, I think, done quite successfully. And we can tell that this changes depending on different periods and locations too. But at many points, the private religion was not necessarily completely separate from official religion, but there was a lot going on that we don't see in more official channels, or that was expressed differently. So that to me implies that maybe this is a question that can be answered, or at least explored. But yeah, I'm just racking my brain.
Ways to get at it.
Yeah.
So when you start your dissertation, are you planning on looking at a specific time period, or is this going to be a very wide diachronic study?
So I'm thinking, with what I read this summer and talking to a few people, I'm thinking that if this is the topic I stick with, a case study approach would probably be the best. There's no way to look at all of Egyptian history. So I haven't really thought of time period, but in my head, an ideal scenario, if it were to work, would be to look at maybe, I don't know, for example, settlement planning, so archaeological evidence in one, and looking at the official stamp on the landscape and how people kind of modified settlement plans to suit their own needs. And then maybe art, there's a lot there as well in terms of where and why the king could be seen in certain contexts and who was really interacting with images of the king. Texts is also a big one. So I think I would have to pull from these different corpora of material. I don't think restricting it to a specific period would do much good. I do think I should probably avoid Amarna, because that's a whole separate can of worms.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the other HAPS scholars she does Amarna.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think I want to do that because that would just be a whole other issue.
Yeah. I feel like that's a dissertation in and of itself.
Exactly. Yeah.
So when we're thinking about it's city planning and that kind of thing, and how people kind of put their mark on the landscape, is it common in Egypt for cities to be planned from the top down, or is it more of a kind of bottom up approach? It's
also somewhat of a question in certain periods. We do see it very strongly in the 12th dynasty, so the Middle Kingdom. We have several examples there of extremely planned cities. Lahoun is a really big one, attached to the funerary monuments of Senwosret II. And that one is very clearly laid out. It seems to have been laid out in different stages, but the houses have similar plans, and it's just a very classic Middle Kingdom city plan, I suppose. And then we also see that, for example, in the Egyptian fortresses in Nubia, those are also, they're not, well, whether they're settlements or not can be disputed, I suppose, but they're clearly very top-down planned as well. And in all of these contexts, we see modifications to the architecture by the people living there. And in the fortresses in particular, we know that in the beginning, when they were first built, these were systems of rotating garrisons of soldiers. And then over time, they started settling there more permanently. And that's when we start seeing a lot of modifications. So it seems really like as maybe people came with families or families grew, there was a need to adapt this top-down model.
That's interesting. So people kind of take what the king and the central elite have imposed on them and modify it to suit their own needs. Do we have any understanding of how present images of the king would have been within domestic areas?
Not there at all. Well, okay. So I'm not sure in terms of portable objects, like amulets and such, that might be a bit less strict, especially in later periods. In earlier periods, we definitely don't see the king in private funerary context, for example. That is really something that we get later in the New Kingdom. So it has been explained in terms of decorum. So what can be displayed where and for what reason. In terms of, in the Amarna period, again, back to Amarna, we do see, for example, the king seems to be more present in private context in terms of, it's almost, and I don't know what you talked to Brianna about, and she'll probably disagree with me, but it almost seems like it's a trinity of gods in the Amarna period. It's the Aten is definitely the most important one, but then Akhenaten and Nefertiti seem to be themselves worshipped in some way. And in that case, see them popping up in private shrines, for example.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So when we have looking at the funerary offering formula you were talking about earlier, do those occur with images of the king, or in those instances is he just restricted to the written section?
Yeah. And I think there's a lot to be done. A lot has been done, but I think there's a lot to be done still in terms of the relationship between image and text, because hieroglyphic text is obviously, I forget what the term is in English. It's a pictorial script, right? So people discuss in terms of literacy. We don't think literacy was probably very high in Egypt, though that's debated, but we think that many of these symbols might have been recognized. Even if they couldn't read the whole thing, they would have known what's
roughly what was being said.
Yeah. So, for example, the king might have been visible in writing in a way that he wasn't in imagery.
Oh, that's interesting. How, and we're kind of going on a tangent here, so apologies if I ask questions that are just completely out there. How similar are the funerary texts? Are they like formula that are essentially cut and pasted across different tombs, or is there more variation allowed?
They are very clearly drawn from a corpus. And later, for example, we have the Book of the Dead, which is this codified set of spells. And then in the Middle Kingdom, we have the so-called coffin texts, which also seem to definitely be coming from a common pool of texts. But there is variation. It's clear that they could kind of personalize their coffin texts and their tombs. And a lot more research is being done on how identity was expressed in funerary culture. A friend of mine is doing her dissertation at Harvard right now, and she's looking at a single tomb and really arguing for the fact that we are indeed able to see individualized identities in these, because for a long time it was thought that they were kind of standardized, kind of all the same. Seems to definitely not be the case, but it is clear that they're drawn from a common source.
That's interesting. And does the excuse me, the section with the king, does that show up like all of the time, or is it sometimes? Do you have a feeling of how often this occurred?
So this formula, the Hetep di Nesut formula is called, and that literally means the offering that the king gives, is pretty much everywhere. It is kind of the formula that often starts a list of offerings that the deceased person is to receive to survive in the afterlife. So it's found in Funerary stelae, it's found in tombs themselves. It's really the most common funerary, I think, at least. This is not my area of expertise, but yeah.
Interesting. And was the idea that, ideally speaking, and I have very little understanding of Egyptian religion, and it's going to show when I open my mouth, is the understanding that the king would literally provide these offerings, or is it more of a like a, I don't know how to phrase it. Do you see what I'm asking?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, and we go back to like the issue of codification again. And for example, the king was supposedly the single priest in every temple, and he was supposed to, do all of the rituals for the gods. Obviously, that's not true. So it's unclear to me, and someone might have a better answer, but it's unclear to me how much of that was really just codification and how much they actually might have believed it. For private people, we know that they also list priests and family members who they knew would also be coming to the tomb, where they hoped, I suppose, would be coming to the tomb with offerings. So there is an understanding, I think, that the tomb was a space for family interaction with the deceased as well. But your question is a really good one, and it's something I should probably look into. I'm not sure.
Thank you very much. That actually kind of are all the questions I had for you. I really appreciate you coming back, especially given how ridiculous this summer has been for everyone. So everybody, we're going to take a very brief break so I can check the chat for questions. If you have questions for Luiza, now is the time to get them in, because I will not take more questions afterwards because I only have one set of eyes and I just can't keep track of all that stuff. So if you have questions, please get them in and we will be right back. If you'd like an expert to answer your questions, then make sure you join us live next time. Check out digitalhammurabi.com/calendar for details of future interviews. And remember to bring your questions. And we are back. Thank you very much, everybody. We have a grand total of one question. So we're going to get to that as soon as possible. This is from the High Evolutionary and says, as kings probably wanted to be portrayed favorably, does that mean we can assume information related to the kings are inherently biased portrayals and not reflective of historical fact?
It's a really good question. I think that's really the crux of the thing I look into. I think assuming that they're not historical is problematic, because they are historical in a way, right? They were written for a specific purpose. But I think assuming that all that these sources tell us is true is equally problematic. So I think as Egyptologists and as historians of the ancient world, we're always kind of straddling this stressful and somewhat awkward line of like, how much do I believe the source and how much does me believing the source 100% kind of misrepresent history? So my particular, I try to do this. It's very hard to do, but to look at these sources in good faith, and by that I mean try and believe what they tell you, but also look at other evidence that might disprove that. So if you're looking at a certain text and you have archaeological evidence that maybe sheds some light on that, or that might show you a different perspective of that text, that's always a good thing. Art as well can, or other texts even, of course. But really just trying to piece it together based on different sources and not just relying on a single text that tells you that the king is great because, that's what he wants you to know. So.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. And that is everything. Is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, I just wanted to thank you again, and for everyone who donated. This is such a great, it's such a great thing to do. It really helps, I think, all of us. So thank you again, and this was really fun. So
it was great. I love these interviews. It's so much fun to hear what everyone is researching and what their plans are and how the field's moving forward. It's wonderful. And if you are watching this and you have no idea what HAPS is, we have a small nonprofit and we give 2 grants. One of them is a summer research grant, which is what Luiza received, and one of them that we haven't started giving out yet, but we'll be doing next year, is the Black Scholars Matter grant that's aimed at Black undergraduate students, getting them to conferences so they can get a head start on their careers. And if you want more information, I've got the web address scrolling across the bottom of the screen. It's just www.hapsfund.com. So go there. We've got a whole load of information. You can read more about Luiza and all of the other HAPS grant recipients. And if you feel so inclined, you can make a donation. And if you do that, we are very grateful. So thank you, everyone. Luiza, thank you again. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Good luck with the rest of your semester. I hope everything kind of calms down and you can actually get some research done soon. And everybody else, thank you for joining us. And until next time, resist poor scholarship. Always ask, how do you know that? Digital Hammurabi is made possible by generous sponsorship from our patrons. Their support means that we have the technological and academic resources necessary to bring the ancient world directly to you. If you want to join the team, go to patreon.com/digitalhammurabi to see how you can help.